Hello and welcome to lecture M6.7, an introduction to clinical healthcare medical terminology. This lecture applies to students in Dublin, Bahrain and Penang. So briefly about this lecture, it has a relatively short screen time in that this recording is quite short. But what I ask students to do is to follow, watch and read the resources provided on the course page. But first, I want to talk about the student BMJ, which is mentioned in another lecture. A student asked me if they needed to pay a subscription fee, and my advice to all students is not to spend any money on a subscription to a journal. If you come across a journal that you're interested in reading, check the library website and that will give you more detail. Or indeed, call over to the library or talk to one of the librarians. They will be very happy to help. Or CSI and Bahrain and Penang subscribe to a range of journals which you can access usually using your username and password. But in the specific case of the student BMJ, it is free to everyone. And I'd just like to take a look at that. If you'll indulge me, I'll change the screen. So here is the BMJ website, student BMJ website. This journal is part of the British Medical Journal and is specifically aimed, obviously, at students, not medical students, but anybody in healthcare, I think, may find the content of the journal interesting. And you can see immediately that the content is aimed directly at students. Doesn't matter which medical school you go to. Sleep disorders, very wide range of information, very wide range of sources directly from the BMJ itself and from blogs associated with the BMJ. You can also see here, doesn't matter which medical school you go to, linked to this main article today. And then there is a link to a place called Doc2Doc, which is a UK based discussion forum for doctors and medical students. So, up-to-date information, some directly relevant to you, some not. There is a United Kingdom bias here, bias in a good way, it's just the way it is. So, obviously some information is not directly related to where you may end up practicing. Like every other website these days and journals, a Facebook presence, there's lots of other social media, and you can follow it whichever way you wish. But one useful way is to register for the site. It takes very, very few details from you. I have done so and I will sign in. I won't remember that password. So we have improved student by integrating it with our social network Doc2Doc. You may choose to use that if it suits you. What I'm really interested in here is the actual content of the student BMJ. As you see, I'm signed in as myself, but down here what they call email alerts, and it's at 5 minutes for students, is a monthly email service that gives you free access to the most relevant articles for medical students from across the BMJ group. BMJ, British Medical Journal, produce many different types of information and a range of journals. So you can click here and in your account then select what type of information you want to appear in this email digest. And it is there's quite a lot of it, and for example, I'm interested I'll have a look at what email alerts I have set up for myself. And what I'm interested is what the editor has to say in the journal. I get a weekly table of contents and press releases. So I pretty much know what's in the BMJ without having to find it. It finds me via email. And then we can get into specific subject areas that you may be interested in also. Let's just take a look what I have done here. And I have subscribed to the monthly email 5 minutes for medical students. Now, this may seem like, oh, it's going to add to your email load. Yes, it will, obviously, but what this is targeted, peer-reviewed, good quality information. And as your career progresses, you'll need to read around in the journals and keep on top of information. And this is an ideal way to do it. I would encourage all students to register and do so. And don't forget also that all other journal services would provide this type of alert. So once again, don't spend any money. If you need a journal, go to the library, and the student BMJ is free to pretty much everyone. So getting back to the lecture, there is a PDF associated with this lecture, Healthcare Terminology for the Electronic Era, published in 2006. The important information in this PDF is a reference to something called SNOMED, and I would like all students to understand, to read the article and understand how SNOMED is used, what it means and how it's used. Again, I want to stress, as part of this lecture, there is a link in the course page, a presentation given by a practicing surgeon who has recorded this, a history-taking example specifically tailored for your class. You may have watched this already, but if not, please ensure that you do so and be able to answer the questions that the surgeon asks in the video. As I say, read the PDF. It's important that you know what SNOMED is and how it is used. And there is a third resource from Medline Plus, which we discussed in the previous lecture. This is information for patients and healthcare professionals about medical dictionaries, and I'll go back to that in a second. So generally what we're looking at is the learning outcomes for this lecture are to understand some basic medical terminology, to understand basic methodologies used in taking a patient history, and to understand the importance of taking a patient history. And watch out for this term. Understand the term pack year as it relates to smoking. You've got to watch the video to understand that. So I can only start by getting into this area with, I suppose, a health warning. In some ways, this is a strange business, really. And this is an article which you may wish to look up in the student BMJ that talks about how medicine is a strange business. And it says, on the one hand, people are always emphasizing the importance of communication. Myself and your lecturers will say this all the time. Be clear. Think about what you want to say. Make sure that you get your points across. But on the other hand, the terms that are used in medicine are so opaque and cloaked in euphemism that it takes a good few years to actually understand what's being said to you. And I think that's a really important statement. Medicine is full of new words, new language, which you all have to become familiar with. And it says here that knowing what people are really talking about can save you a whole heap of trouble. And remember, this comes from the student BMJ. This is a student giving you advice on how they see the world. It's well worth reading. Articles written by students for students. So, communication is vital, but we've entered into a world that is filled with impenetrable language. And if you can understand it, you're doing well. So let's take a look at this article here from the American Journal of Emergency Medicine. Very simple title, Medical Communication. Do our patients understand? Now, what do they do here? Let's look at the methods for this study. And from the paper it says the objective of the study was to determine emergency department patients' understanding of common medical terms. They took patients over the age of 18, had non-urgent conditions, and they recruited them for the study. So these are patients who weren't in a hurry, obviously, or weren't in enormous amounts of distress. And the patients were asked whether 6 pairs of terms had the same or different meaning, and were scored on the number of correct answers they gave. So take a look at these results. Now, I appreciate that you're interested in medicine and physiotherapy. Obviously, this is why you're here. But just step out of that interest, that professional identity, and look in as somebody who knows very little about medicine or only enters into the medical world by virtue of need. And these are some very interesting numbers here. Almost 80% of these patients didn't recognize that bleeding and hemorrhage was the same thing. And you can think about that. If a patient were to overhear he's hemorrhaging, they may think that's far worse than just bleeding. So it can have all sorts of implications. Again, nearly 80% didn't know the difference between fracture and broken in bones, heart attack versus myocardial infarction, 38% for stitches versus sutures, and 37% for diarrhea versus loose stools. And I suppose if we go down to cast versus splint, you can see maybe that these terms are more readily available or recognizable by patients. I did read something some time ago, a quote from Hugh Laurie, who plays Gregory House in House, which I know a lot of you will recognize. The article was interviewing him about the amount of medical terminology that he had to recite and use in the script. Now, Hugh Laurie's father was actually a practicing doctor, but Hugh Laurie decided to be a policeman in Hong Kong, of all things, so he took a completely different career path and came into acting later in life. But when asked if he understood any of what he was saying and the complex medical jargon, he said he had no idea what was going on, but it all sounded very interesting. So we hear a lot of these phrases, we don't know what they mean, but it all sounds very intriguing, and from the patient's point of view it can be possibly stressful. Another article here from a journal called Community Health Nursing, the impact of medical terminology on the readability of patient education material. So this is what happens when we give patients information. So, okay, the contractor says, we understand that you may need more information, so I'm handing you a resource, a piece of paper or a link to a website, and hopefully this will help you understand. So the findings are quite interesting, and it says giving patients a printed brochure does not guarantee either learning or behavior change. Just because you've actually given the patient something doesn't necessarily mean that anything's going to change. Giving patients a printed brochure that they can neither read nor understand virtually guarantees that no patient learning or behavior will change, or behavior change will occur in relation to the content of the brochure. So it might look well, it might be printed well, it might be on glossy paper, but what's actually been said on it? Well-written printed materials can provide valuable information for self-care behavior in a format easy for patients to use as reference for their own health. So how these resources are written, the language used, are all crucial. Non-technical, easy to understand language. But the main finding that strikes me from this journal article is that giving patients a printed brochure does not guarantee either learning or behavior change. Typically, says the article, some type of interaction between the patient and the healthcare provider is needed. So context, handing them the information, giving patients a link to a website is just not enough. We need to contextualize that information and perhaps provide some background information. Now, on that issue of medical jargon, medical terminology, on Medline Plus there is this rather rudimentary looking online learning package called Understanding Medical Words. The link is there. The link is also on the course page, and I would like students to follow that link. There's a little tutorial in there and take it. It's going to look very basic by virtue of design, but the content is very, very good. So they talk about word parts, and this is the key really to understanding a lot of medical terminology. There's 4 parts, and they're used to create very complex medical terms: roots, combining forms, suffixes and prefixes. So I pay attention to that construction. There are plenty of examples, and you need to step through the tutorial. It's really important that you do. Now, I'm focusing back now on the history taking aspect of this lecture. Again, you need to watch that video. History taking is not just an exercise in collecting data. It's more than just completing a form or ticking boxes. We're looking at a medical and health history, and it will be the basis of all the treatment that's rendered to the patient. It forms a living and breathing document, and it forms the basis of a great deal of interaction afterwards. It's also legal. A patient chart or a file or a record or whatever language is used is a legal document of treatment, and all information entered into it must be documented precisely and accurately. Now, we'll talk about the legality of this patient information at another stage, but remember that the patient chart is the one and only source of information and has legal status. So taking a patient history is pivotal to the examination process and is the very first step. The question is, tell me what seems to be the trouble, getting the patient to talk to you. Your first impressions will count. Patients will make decisions about how they're going to interact with the process and you in the first few minutes. And this, in history taking, is an opportunity to form a relationship with the patient. It's very much down to your individual style, but there are obvious ways to construct this relationship. And the chief complaint is what you're after. What's actually the problem? And that is a statement by the patient giving details of the most significant symptoms or signs of illness. The patient presented saying he was woken up by a sharp pain in the middle of the night, and this has been happening for a week. That's the chief complaint. That's not the diagnosis, it's what the patient, the statement by the patient. This is crucial. How the patient presents to you, what they say, what is the big thing they feel is going on with them. It may not actually be what's wrong with them, but it is how they report to you. So, taking that history, and again you'll hear it when you watch the video, you're encouraged to ask balanced, open-ended questions, not yes or no questions. You want people to engage in the process. Does it hurt here? Yes or no is not an ideal question. You may try it, but tell me, whereabouts does it hurt? Show me. And does anything make the pain worse? Those kind of things. You want to be non-biased. You don't want to lead the patient into a question. And if you get something vague, you need to explore that. So this vagueness is a non-compliance to a degree. They're not giving you a full answer. Do you smoke? Yes, I have a few every day. What does that mean, a few? We need a number. We need to be able to enter this number onto the record. And when speaking with the patient, you want to avoid the jargon, as we've said. Patients don't understand it, or the majority of patients, and evidence shows that they don't. And depending on different socioeconomic backgrounds, that will vary widely. And avoid judging the patient during the interaction. So, as I say, a shorter lecture. Please follow up on the course page and post any questions you have in the forum.